So my story actually started in October of 1968. I was born into a family with two wonderful parents, an older sister and two older brothers. So I got my name because my parents was hoping that I was a girl, and they were hoping that I was the last one. As luck would have it, they got their girl, and I am the last one. So my siblings and I were raised on the east coast of the United States in a small country town called Trinity, North Carolina. And our neighborhood that we grew up in was predominantly made up of families that looked just like us. And we truly lived according to the African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. So this meant that in our neighborhood, we could go to anybody's house, we could eat, we could sleep, we could play, we could study, and it was just like being at home. Now, on the other hand, if we got into trouble while we were away from home, our neighbors didn't hesitate to discipline us. Then when we got home, we got it all over again. So our family was really active in our local community and particularly in our church. So on the other hand, the schools that I attended growing up had a 90 to 95% Caucasian population. So throughout school, I was an honor roll student. I was secretary of our student government association, and I was one of the captains of the girls' basketball team. So life was pretty good for me. But as you may know, people of color growing up in the southern part of the United States, that wasn't necessarily the case due to racism that they had to face. So I consider myself to be very blessed that I never in my life recall having to experience racism or being treated differently. That is, not until I became a parent at the tender age of 15. So here I was, a mere teenager, with this awesome responsibility now of raising another human being. What was I going to do? How was I going to get my life back on track to where I could provide any sort of a future for myself and now for a child? So quite naturally, my life was turned upside down. So I had to come up with a plan to figure out, how am I going to get my life back on track? So I spoke with my parents, because some people in my village even started to treat me differently. So I spoke to my parents and I told them about some of the things that I was experiencing. And I told them, I said, I really need to find a place where I can continue my education in a safe and nurturing environment. Although my external physique was changing, I was still the same person on the inside. I still had the same dreams. I still had the same ambitions. So we talked about it, and we did our research, and we located a school in Charlotte, North Carolina, that on paper appeared to be the perfect place. And after a visit to this campus, I knew without a doubt that this was where I was supposed to spend this particular time in my life. So my parents and I made the decision that I would move away from what was familiar and comfortable to me to attend school an hour and a half away from home. Pretty tough for a 15-year-old, now a pregnant 15-year-old. But this was by far the toughest, but the absolute best life decision that I've ever made, hands down. And the reason is because at this school, not only were we able to continue our education, but we had around-the-clock prenatal care with doctors and nurses on staff 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And we were taught how to take care of ourselves as well as how to take care of our unborn children. So it was in this new environment that I decided that no matter what it took, I was going to college, and that I was going to provide this child with the same opportunities in life that my parents had provided for me, if not better opportunities. So the girls that attended this school at the time that I was there, some had decided to give their children up for adoption, and some decided to keep and raise their children. For me, there was never a question. I always knew that I would keep my child and that I would raise it myself. So the girls from this also came from all walks of life. Some came from families that were very wealthy. Some came from families that were very poor. And some were middle class. But we were white, we were black, we were Asian, etc. So this was the first time in my life that I really paid attention to differences. And I realized that people in general were more alike than different, and that our situations or our circumstances didn't define us. Now, this life experience did not make me non-judgmental by any means, but it made me more self-aware and less judgmental, because I knew firsthand what it felt like to be treated differently. So this was also the first realization for me that my outer village was much larger and much stronger than my inner village. So after giving birth to my son, of course, I moved back home to try to resume some sense of normalcy in my life. And after this happened, my mom and I sat down and we started to talk, and she really told me, she said, you really need to tell your story. I'm thinking, I just got out of this. I'm trying to get back to normal. No. She said, no, you really should. She said, because you could really make a difference in somebody else's life. So I thought about it. I said, you know what, you're right. So I agreed to tell my story to other teenagers, both boys and girls, to try to encourage them to take a different path in life. Now, this decision for me to tell my story was also very difficult, because it was very hard for me to speak so openly about something that most people saw as embarrassing and shameful. But I told my story anyway. I told my story in underprivileged housing, at churches, at youth conferences, at seminars. I pretty much told my story wherever I felt like it needed to be told. And every time I told my story, I cried. Every time I told my story, I cried. And a lot of times we think of tears as signs of weakness or sadness, but that was so not the case for me. My tears were tears of strength, tears of joy, and tears of thankfulness for just being given another opportunity to get my life right. Because I realized then, as well as now, that had I not had such a loving and supportive family, our story would have turned out so much differently. So I'll never forget one incident in particular when I told my story at a church youth conference. After the conference was over, we were standing around mingling with some of the conference attendees. And I noticed an older lady approaching me. She was walking on a cane. She was bent over because she had problems with her back. When she finally got to me, she could barely lift her head to look me in the face. And she thanked me for telling my story. And she said that had somebody shared their story with her as a young girl, her life would have been totally different. So she thanked me with tears in her eyes, and she told me that she would begin to think about herself differently with the time she had left on earth, and that she too would share her story. I was in shock. So here I was thinking that I was there just to talk to the kids in the audience. And I actually made a connection and a difference in the life of an 84-year-old lady. So although I didn't know what to call it at the time, this was my first experience with diversity and inclusion, because I knew what it felt like. I also attributed this time in my life to the initial development of my leadership skills. Because now I had this other responsibility, and I had to look at how my decisions also affected my son. So I always had to consider how that would impact him and be willing to change course instantaneously if necessary. So as I started to grow professionally and attend different conferences and seminars, I'd come back home and practice what I learned on Stephen. So, when he was younger, worked like a piece of cake because he had no idea he was my test subject. But as he got older, he started to catch on to this thing. And he'd look at me and say, "Ma, you're doing that thing again. Stop it." So I'm a firm believer that the times that we think are the worst times in our lives are actually the times that shape and define who we are. We just have to be brave enough to get beyond our fear of self-reflection and actually connect to it to discover who we truly are as leaders of diversity. That moment with that older lady in church was my ultimate defining moment. To never be afraid to tell the story of who I am, because you never know who the intended recipient may be. And you don't want to miss a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make a difference in somebody else's life. So I challenge each and every one of you to embark on a journey of self-reflection. Who is the older lady in your life? What life experiences have you had that have helped to shape who you are as a leader? And when I say leader, I don't just mean it in the formal sense in terms of a business or person that manages others. Every organization, every community, every team has informal leaders. And you also have to be the leader of your own life. So how are you sharing your true leadership story to make a difference in somebody else's life? So I challenge you to take a closer look in the mirror and discover that your true leadership story may be closer and much clearer than you may think. So I encourage you to go out there in the world and find your older lady, because you'll be glad that you did. Thank you.